Dead End Psycho in Fallout, Skooma in Elder Scrolls. Then you have caffeine in The Sims, and basically everything in Grand Theft Auto, and even the mushrooms in Mario. So, what are the most realistic portrayals of drugs in video games? Turns out nobody's actually looked at this, so I will give you my perspective as a drug scientist who plays a lot of video games. Now, before I begin, please note that these are all based on my knowledge of this from video games that I have played. So I'm going to be missing some, feel free to recommend others, but I have specific blind spots. So I grew up in 1987, very poor, so I didn't have access to video games for a while, but then competitively played things like StarCraft 2 when I was doing my PhD, and am planning a vacation to Las Vegas with my husband so we can go to all the Fallout New Vegas spots. So that should tell you about the kind of games that you're going to be hearing about. So I'll actually start with my favorite universe, which is, of course, Fallout. It is pretty reliable in terms of how it portrays drugs. So first, it has things like addiction. So you can actually become addicted to substances, and then you have to go to like a doctor to get the addiction taken off. And they actually have like perks within the game that allow you to change how resistant you are to chemicals. So there's like chem resistant, where you don't really get the effects of it. But then there's also things like party animal, where the effects of alcohol are not so problematic for you. Like, it is a pretty impressive video game universe for drugs. So I'm gonna rate that 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10 because it gets a -1 for the junkie weapons. I don't like the stigmatizing language there. What about their specific chemicals? So the first one that I want to talk about is jet, which is seemingly like a different version of crystal. So it's considered a methamphetamine according to the storyline. Now I'm going to give jet an 8.5 out of 10 for realism, and let me explain why. So first, it actually does seem to have the stimulant-like effects. So it increases AP, but also has addictive side effects. So in terms of specifically the addictive potential here, it talks about withdrawal and how if you use it more often, you're more likely to become addicted to it, of which are both of those are core concepts in drug science. So like, good job, Fallout, for that. Now, the reason that I give it an 8.5 out of 10 and not a 10 out of 10 is because it actually slows down time. That is one of the primary effects. Stimulants actually speed up people's perception of time. But in reality, stimulants are going to actually make you feel as though time is moving faster and not produce that slow-mo effect that you're more commonly seeing in the game. Now, Psycho is another drug in the Fallout universe that seems to be having stimulant-like effects as well. But if you actually look at what it's causing, this seems to be more like what people think PCP is. So it's linked to things like, okay, well, you can just deal more damage and you can also resist more damage. So this is the idea that people think that like they basically can do anything when they're on their PCP. They're unstoppable. And that is not true, but PCP does change your perception of pain, so it makes you feel like you might be more unstoppable. But if you're thinking about it as PCP, that doesn't really decrease your intelligence, which supposedly Psycho does. So yeah, doesn't really fit any specific type of drug here. So I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10. And the last one I'm going to talk about in Fallout is Buff Out, which is one that I use the most often because I am pretty much always over encumbered. So Buff Out basically allows you to like carry more and you're stronger and increases your endurance. But once it wears off, that wears off too. This could be like your standard performance enhancing type of drug, like steroids or a different type of stimulant. But it needs to give more side effects. So I'm going to give this like a 9 out of 10 in terms of how realistic it is. Oh, and I forgot to mention alcohol in Fallout. They just have like beer and whiskey and things like that. And yeah, this has the best side effects in a game that I've ever seen. So alcohol can be addictive in this game. It also makes you lose your intelligence, but it increases your charisma. And it does things like increases your strength too. And it's particularly good in survival mode. Now, I've never officially played it in that mode because that's not how I play video games, but I've heard that it's fantastic in that mode. So yeah, 10 out of 10 for alcohol in Fallout. Well, let's stay with Bethesda for a minute and then move to Elder Scrolls. And so Elder Scrolls has something called moon sugar, and this is supposedly a narcotic, and it's kind of like the base of the trade of a lot of the different societies there. And so this actually is somewhat realistic from the idea of like drug trade as well as the idea of like a narcotic. Like moon sugar is supposed to be a narcotic, and then skooma is like moon sugar plus nightshade. So they're narcotic plus like a different type of poison that's even more addictive. Now, moon sugar gets an 8 out of 10 for me because of the importance in trade, but also problems with the narcotic and addiction. But I'm going to say that skooma actually gets a little bit less, like a 7 out of 10 for realism for me. And so like the other problematic pieces, like it's smoked and then you get like euphoria and then lethargy, like that is pretty realistic for things like opiates. And so I think of this as like an opium versus like fen situation. Like the moon sugar is the opium and the fen is the skooma. So I'm going to say that skooma is a little less realistic because there's not really a drug that people cannot kick an addiction from, but how it works and how it manifests, yeah, that's pretty realistic. Next up, Batman Arkham Asylum. Now, if you're any sort of Batman fan, you probably know where I'm going here. Scarecrow has what is known as a fear toxin, which is actually fairly realistic. So I'd say about a 9 out of 10 on realism, because there are drugs that can make you hallucinate. And if you just basically made a drug that increased serotonin as well as like increased adrenaline or like norepinephrine, it could make you do things like hallucinate while also being afraid. And we know that it's fairly easy to make somebody have a bad trip. How can you reliably prompt somebody to like picture up their worst fears and then that is going to cause them to do that? Probably not. But yeah, in terms of realism, I'm gonna go 9 out of 10 on Scarecrow's fear toxin. Now, what about the mushrooms in Mario? Well, they make you larger, and so maybe it's like that blue mushroom that you can get that gives you Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where you feel like you're either really tiny or you're like really large. It just makes things like different sizes for you. So like maybe there's that, but yeah, no side effects, no realistic thing. So I'm gonna go 4 out of 10 for the Super Mario mushrooms. What about the caffeine in Sims? Now, I don't talk about Sims a lot because this was one of the standard things as a female gamer that I was like, oh, you play Sims, don't you? I never actually really played Sims, not that it matters. People can play whatever games they want to. There's this idea of like caffeine in it. So you can have a coffee maker and the caffeine gives you more energy, but then also makes you have to pee. But then also takes off the like effects of sleep deprivation. So that's fairly good. So I'm gonna actually give that like 9.5 out of 10. So I'm gonna take a point off for it causing overheating, which is not a common side effect of caffeine, but I'm gonna add a half a point for the coffee makers breaking down all the time because that's realistic. Now, what about Bliss in the Far Cry series? So this came about later in like Far Cry 5. And Bliss is supposedly a drug that comes from a flower that looks a lot like Datura, and supposedly makes you hallucinate, but pretty much every other effect does not make sense in terms of Datura. Yeah, that's a drug that works in the acetylcholine system, so it could cause some of like the nervous system side effects that you see, but it's not going to do anything like mind control to help you with colds. And it should not actually cause constricted pupils. In fact, it should cause dilated pupils. So I'm gonna give that like a 4 out of 10 because like it has some aspects that it obviously tried to mimic after the drug, but didn't actually get them right. Now, what about tryptophan or Tripto in Heavy Rain? Well, this one is pretty close to what you would actually see for an opioid. So it has a lot of the dependence, it has the withdrawal. You're seeing that they might be using it for reasons to like help the effects of other things. I'm gonna give this a 6 out of 10 because it's somewhat realistic in that like they're using it in a specific way. They're using it in snorting, but like the nosebleeds don't make sense for how the drug is supposed to work. And then the name doesn't make sense. So like tryptophan, is it supposed to be named after cocaine with the cane part? But that's a stimulant, so that's not what it does. Or is it supposed to be named after like trypto, which is like maybe like tryptophan or something involving serotonin, but it doesn't involve that either, so I have no idea what's going on here. I can't talk about drugs in video games without talking about GTA, which I have not played for any long period of time, but I know that there's a side quest in which basically Michael ends up like smoking a joint of homegrown stuff and ends up having hallucinations where they have to kill aliens. Now, yes, we do see that certain components of cannabis might be linked to things like hallucinations, but it's relatively rare and seems to be more closely linked to intravenous use. And have I personally ever heard of anybody using weed intravenously? No. Now, side note, in GTA, it doesn't seem like the main characters enjoy actually taking the drugs, but in terms of drug dealing they're fine with that, so weird ethical scenarios here. So my rating for GTA is problematic. So now I'm pretty sure I know what my next background study is going to be, so stay tuned for stuff in the future.